The mysteries of this world are becoming easier to solve day by day as technology gets more advanced. This makes mysteries that we can't solve just that more interesting. We're here to cover these stories and possibly lead the unsolved to be a little bit more solved. This is Unresolved Weekly.
Paula Abdul is an American singer-songwriter appearing on American Idol as a judge. She was born on June 19, 1962 in California. Paula was obsessed with dancing, so much so that she dropped out of CSU to pursue her career in it. Luckily, this paid off as the Jackson 5 noticed her talent and hired her as an assistant dance director for their Victory Tour. She quickly rose to fame and soon won an Emmy for her hard work on The Tracy Ullman Show. And here's where things get interesting. In 1991, she went on her Under My Spell tour, aka the Spellbound Tour. Later in 2003, she claimed that during that tour she was involved in a plane crash. More specifically, she said, "It all happened when I boarded a 7-seater plane, and an hour into the flight one of the engines blew up, and the right wing caught on fire and everything went black. I woke up in the hospital only to find I had crushed my cervical spine, leaving me partially paralyzed." Interestingly enough, though, there's no documented mention of it at all before Paula's 2003 NBC interview. Another noteworthy thing to mention is that the album following Spellbound was her worst-selling release. She was divorced twice between 1994 and 1998. Between her Spellbound era and about 1996, Paula seemed to stay out of the spotlight. We know that at that time, Paula had also been searching for a cure for her bulimia. There was also a rumor that she was being treated for opioid addiction. Her career and personal life seemed to have gone downhill after a Spellbound tour, and it's debated whether this was because of the plane crash, or whether the plane crash was invented to sweep this under the rug. One problem with her story is that Paula said that she performed in St. Louis before the fateful flight, heading to Denver. Some of the problems with this is that there's no St. Louis tour dates on her website. User/Catchupsunshine made an interesting theory, and that is that she was on a plane during the Under My Spell tour, wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and was injured when the plane experienced turbulence mid-flight, and this compounded her existing spinal injuries, and her condition deteriorated for several years until around 1994 her health problems prevented her from working. She took a break from the limelight to recover, came back for American Idol, and decided to embellish her story to garner sympathy and distract from other issues that contributed to her break. I'm unsure whether or not she had an addiction to painkillers, but I lean towards no. Her story of using alternative medicine in response to her injuries from the crash partially convinced me that the strange behavior people point to as proof of her being on drugs is actually just her being herself. But who knows, maybe there was a crash that day. But I guess it will remain unresolved.
Sometime in the 1930s, a man named Albert Johnson caused residents of Canada's Yukon Territory a bit of trouble. Around Fort McPherson, in Canada's Yukon Territory, Albert Johnson frequently quarreled with natives. As 200 out of the 230 residents were indigenous peoples, a European like Albert sticks out like a sore thumb. As natives were already skeptical of European outsiders, relations between the groups quickly went south. Albert repeatedly threatened natives multiple times with his rifle. The same natives then complained that Albert was sabotaging their animal traps. There were a lot of complaints going to the police. Tensions rose between the residents, and finally everything broke loose. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police finally decided to question Albert. They were already skeptical of him, as he did not own a trapping license. They found him in the market one day and asked him about the sabotage accusations. He gave short and evasive answers, then went to hide in his wilderness cabin. The police traveled to his cabin, and seeing smoke coming from the chimney, they knocked on his door. Albert ignored him, and a few days later they returned with a warrant. The mounted police forced their way in, where they took rifle fire from Albert. One of the officers was hit, and while his comrades dragged him away from the scene, Albert escaped out the back and into the woods. The mounted police quickly regrouped in the nearby town of Aquavit. From there, they chased Albert through the Canadian wilderness. Over the course of a month, they traveled a total of 150 miles, even crossing a 7,000-foot mountain peak. The police were fed up with the chase and called in a search plane. They quickly found the suspect and engaged him in a final skirmish, wounding one officer and killing Albert. The real mystery comes when police tried to identify him. His DNA did not show any matches in their database. He did not leave any journals or identification behind. Albert did not have any family, and in a last-ditch effort, police took photos of his corpse and distributed them across Canada. Nothing came up. He was noted as having a Scandinavian accent, leading authorities to believe that he was from Scandinavia or from the Midwest of the United States. Isotope testing later confirmed this theory. Albert Johnson might have been a World War I veteran, as police noted his proficiency with weapons in their brief battles. He could have adapted a false name and moved to a remote part of Canada to escape the World War II draft. He could have also been on the run. Albert was noted to have been quick and curt in his encounters with other people. He was also a social recluse. For this reason, people think he might have committed a bad crime and was hell-bent on evading the authorities, as they would uncover his secrets. Whatever the case, Albert Johnson's real name and background were never uncovered and left to our imaginations.
In late 2000, the Pakistani police found something that would shock many. The police had received a tip that there was a man selling a mummy. The man, Ali Akbar, had a video showcasing this mummy and his intent to sell it. The police interrogated him, and Akbar led the police to the home of Wali Muhammad Riki, which was the province of Baluchistan. Riki explained that he received the remains of an Iranian named Sharif Shah Baki, in which Baki claimed to have retrieved the mummy right after an earthquake had hit a local town. The two men were going to sell the mummy on the black market for what they thought it was worth, upwards of $11 million. In fact, this was a pretty fair deal for what they had acquired. One of the main reasons is because up to that time, it was known that mummification was a private process known only to Egyptians. But these men had shared that they had believed that the mummification was actually Persian. This alone would drive up the price a bit, but it gets better. Apparently, upon the breastplate, written in Persian, it reads, "I am the daughter of great King Xerxes. Mazareka, protect me. I am Rodajun, I am." This would bring the price of the remains even higher, but to the men's dismay, the police confiscated the mummy and donated it to the National Museum in Karachi. The two men were arrested and charged for violating the Antiquities Act, which would lead to a possible 10-year sentence. Different governments began to argue as to who owned this mummy, and during that chaos, it lay under guard in the National Museum, being systematically examined by archaeologists. At first, they showed that inside this stone coffin lay a woman only 4'7", even though examination showed she was of 21 years of age during the time of her death. And if the identity was legitimate, it would have been around 600 BC, though science demanded further satisfaction, so photos of the cuneiform breastplate, snippets of the reed mat on which the body lay, and carvings of her sarcophagus were all dispatched to various experts for translation, testing, and scrutiny. The results of this were very disappointing. It turned out that part of her mat was dated to be around 50 years ago. and the translations weren't perfect. This does not count out the woman as a mummy. A common theory is that the sellers had found a real mummy and dressed it to look Persian for a higher profit from their customers. Though the mummification was not necessarily a well-done job, this is where the mystery goes cold. After physicians at the hospital where the princess had been examined took a closer look, they noticed something. A particular section of her middle ear, where the 3 smallest bones in the human body were held in place by fragile tendons and ligaments that could never have remained intact had she truly died around 600 BC, or even just a few decades ago. This body was new. Also, something else emerged, which the physicians described as a significant distortion of the normal anatomy. Her back was broken by a blunt object which struck her from the right, and an autopsy showed that the vertebrae in her neck veered off at 90 degrees. Her spinal column had been snapped in two. Instead of the traditional materials, her abdominal cavity had been stuffed in with table salt and baking soda. Radiocarbon testing showed that she had only died in 1996. At the very least, the Pakistani police were now dealing with a ring of premeditated forgers who had gotten together, prepared in advance, and then stolen and crudely mummified a woman's body within 24 hours of her death. And at the very worst, they were dealing with a gang of murderers. All of the middlemen and all of the suspects were re-interviewed, but the investigation went nowhere. The police concluded that the woman was most likely from the border region where the mummy had been found, but they had never been able to identify her. Disturbingly, the next year, 2 more Persian mummies emerged on the black market, most likely faked by the exact same gang.
Hello everyone, I hope you enjoyed the stories we shared with you today. If not, check by next week, there might be something more interesting for you then. If you have any story suggestions, let us know by commenting. We'll be more than happy to look over them. I'm Bruce.
I'm Jim.
I'm Chris.
And this has been
Unresolved Weekly.